Disclaimer: before I start this video, I would like to make clear that this script was written before the recent peace process in Gaza. Not all the information and sources may be entirely up to date, but the general points and arguments made are potentially more relevant than ever. Please keep this in mind as you watch this video. Since the start of the ongoing genocide in Gaza in October 2023, the mainstream pro-Palestinian movement, persistent for a considerable amount of time in the Western zeitgeist, particularly in left-wing spaces, has re-emerged and proven itself to be more powerful and influential than ever before. The scenes currently unfolding in Gaza are some of, if not the most brutal in the history of the conflict, as subsequently the eyes of more people than ever before have been opened to the scale of the issue. Clearly, more people than at any other point in this conflict's long and grueling history are choosing to align themselves with the Palestinian side of the argument, and for the first time in its history, arguably, the movement has finally forced the hand of Western governments, with the UK, France, and Canada among a handful of countries choosing to recognize a Palestinian state. While this undeniably does hurt Israel's image on the world stage, as a massive popular movement opposed to the actions of your state is never a good thing, seen before through what the anti-apartheid movement did to the South African regime, the actual impact it has on Israel is minimal, and in my opinion, all the mainstream pro-Palestinian movement actually does is serve to provide platform for what Israel deems almost to be acceptable criticism of its policies and actions against the Palestinian people. Israel is very well aware that what they are doing is wrong, excessive, and possibly unjustified, but the harsh reality is that they do not care. Pro-Palestinian protesters in the West can continually call out the actions of the Israeli military and state against the Palestinian people as being unjustified, but all this does is continue to perpetuate stereotypes that people on the pro-Israel side of the argument attack the pro-Palestinian side with, and provide them with labels to do so. The extent to which the current mainstream pro-Palestinian movement is actually any powerful is limited by these factors. Firstly, the pro-Israel side of the argument is simply far more powerful. Secondly, the demographic of people typically associated with Palestinian activism in the West is typically disliked, and associated with a branch of politics your average person does not particularly want to associate themselves with. Thirdly, as aforementioned, stereotypes regarding the pro-Palestinian movement create a negative image of it in the minds of your average person. And finally, in my eyes, the most important and crucial reason as to why the mainstream pro-Palestinian movement is ineffective is that it does not do enough to analyze or criticize the true intentions of the Israeli state, and appears to be afraid of being denoted as anti-Semitic. Reason 1. The pro-Israel side of the argument in the West is simply far more powerful. Although this is undeniably, for the most part, not something that the pro-Palestinian movement can dictate, it is simply fact that pro-Israel and Zionist lobby groups have an almost completely unchecked amount of power and influence over Western politics. AIPAC in the United States, or the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, is the most well-known of countless pro-Israel interest groups in the United States, and the ability it has to influence American politics through spending millions to get favorable candidates elected and by paying huge sums of money to politicians on both sides of the political spectrum far exceeds that of the majority of other lobby groups. In Europe, Israeli lobby groups also use money to influence politicians from all over the political spectrum. In the United Kingdom, for example, both the Conservatives and Labour are associated with separate Friends of Israel groups. In 2014, the Conservative Friends of Israel stated that 80% of Tory MPs were members of the group, which currently includes former Home Secretary and Chancellor Sajid Javid, Priti Patel, who served as Home Secretary under Boris Johnson, and former Prime Minister David Cameron. Similarly, several prominent Labour MPs, including current frontbenchers Yvette Cooper and David Lammy, are members of the separate Labour Friends of Israel group. Similar organisations also exist for Reform UK and the Liberal Democrats. The EU has also taken a notably cautious approach to the conflict, and several EU member states continue to not recognise a Palestinian state. Despite recent developments involving European countries agreeing to recognise a Palestinian state, these developments are too little, too late, and do nothing to combat the actual genocide in Gaza, and seemingly have only taken place to appease public discontent over the issue. Regardless of what European countries do, they are virtually powerless in holding Israel accountable. As long as Israel has the unconditional backing of the United States, it doesn't matter what anyone else says. The voice of the US even has proven to be virtually powerless in reining Israel in, especially since the war in Gaza began. Although it seems unfair to scrutinize the pro-Palestinian movement for the fact that Western governments have their hands tied when it comes to dealing with Israel, the movement itself does little to bring attention to to this fact. Rightfully so, the pro-Palestinian movement in the West has pulled the wool off of the eyes of so many who would otherwise be oblivious to the level of suffering in Gaza right now, but it has done little to actually criticize Western governments for their almost overt corruption and blatant greed which is behind their support for Israel. The movement chooses to scapegoat random corporations with vague ties to Israel, calling for boycotts of companies which most people simply cannot afford. It does little to point out the degree of control that pro-Israel lobby groups have over American politics in particular either. The bigger questions are never asked as to why the US has supported Israel unconditionally despite the damaging effect it has on its reputation, and the relationship not really being that beneficial for the US in terms of strategic aims in the Middle East. The fact that said support is propped up by persistent Israeli lobbying efforts in Western politics, however, is undeniable, something that the pro-Palestinian movement has consistently failed to point out, and when it does, it leaves out the bigger picture, which will be explained later on. Reason 2. The pro-Palestinian movement is typically associated with the far left, and to a lesser extent elements of the far right, both of these groups being undesirable to be deemed as being associated with. The heavy contrast in the political beliefs of your average pro-Palestinian and the average apolitical person creates tension and strain within the movement, weakening its appeal. Some of the most prominent examples of direct action on behalf of the pro-Palestinian movement have taken place in a fashion that can only be described as being overtly political, which is unavoidable due to the subject matter of the movement itself. However, pro-Palestinian and anti-Zionist ideas as part of mainstream leftist political thinking are often juxtaposed with ideas that seemingly have very little correlation to the Palestinian issue. Leftist groups often advocate for causes like the LGBT movement and Marxist political principles, and it is obvious to see why these are highly contradictory to ideas of anti-Zionism and Palestinian nationalism. Whilst the actions of leftist movements have garnered significant amounts of political attention towards Gaza, especially over the last 2 years, they have also attracted significant ridicule as the association between ideas regarding Palestinian nationalism and leftism as an ideology in general have been mocked in pro-Israel spheres, creating an image in the minds of many who would not otherwise have been particularly informed on the issue of the pro-Palestinian movement as lacking education and of being generally unaware. Videos taken at pro-Palestinian rallies, albeit cherry-picked, make fun of those at the rally seemingly unaware of what they are protesting for, as interviewers ask questions such as, "From what river to what sea?" referring to the common pro-Palestinian slogan of "From the river to the sea," and taking full advantage of the inability of the respondent to adequately answer the question. These videos have reached large audiences and only serve to bolster this idea to those not already involved with the movement. The association of the pro-Palestinian movement in the West with leftist ideals has served therefore to undermine and hurt the image of the movement with those unfamiliar to it. On the other hand, in similar but albeit quite different fashion, and a seemingly more recent phenomenon, the pro-Palestinian movement has seemingly become affiliated with certain elements of the right wing. Although anti-Israel sentiment has long been a thing on certain elements of the right, in the last couple of years, as a result of the war in Gaza, and thanks to unrelated events such as the general growth in anti-Israel sentiment, particularly over the last year or so, for reasons I'm not going to get into right now, pro-Palestinian sentiment has become increasingly associated with the anti-mainstream right. Seeing commentators like Nick Fuentes, who have bigger audiences than ever before, calling out the genocide in Gaza and the extent of Israeli influence in American politics has helped the movement to reach an entirely new audience, albeit with highly contrasting views to that of the aforementioned pro-Palestinian leftist movement. The labeling of the anti-Israel right in particular as anti-Semitic has helped to suppress prominent right-wing anti-Israel voices, and much of the mainstream right is, let's just say, a bit too enthusiastic about Israel to have their minds changed. The alt-right is also an extremely negatively labeled group, and alt-right political opinions are generally not ones that you can hold without consequence, as you can very easily create a negative impression on most people with those opinions. Although this can be considered to be true of more radical elements of the left, alt-right opinions are much more likely to get you into trouble, which leads me on to my next point. Reason 3. Stereotypes regarding members of the pro-Palestinian movement are generally off-putting to your average person. Most people would rather be seen as apolitical for the sake of their social standing. A lot of what I'm going to talk about in this section can be fairly easily linked to my previous point, that certain political groups which place an emphasis on support for Palestine and opposition towards Israel are, for the most part, unappealing to those who are mostly apolitical. Both leftism and the alt-right have a number of negative stereotypes around them which the average person may attach to them. For example, ideology which does not necessarily appeal to most people in the political mainstream, and the fact that both groups have engaged in political violence, which obviously acts as off-putting. Affiliation with these groups often leads to social consequences as well, particularly on the far right of the spectrum, However, examples of it have been seen on the opposing side of the spectrum in recent weeks in the aftermath of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, with there having been multiple cases of people losing their jobs for comments regarding his death. Whether or not you believe this is a good thing is completely up for discussion, but it does point out that holding politically untoward and politically incorrect viewpoints can have a significant effect on your social standing and your life itself. There are very many people in the world right now who deep down hold political opinions they know to be controversial and often just choose to keep quiet out of fear of mass societal reprimand. The pro-Palestinian stance is undeniably seen as deserving of said reprimand by quite a large section of society. The association of the movement in particular with groups like Palestine Action, designated as a terrorist organization by the British government, and with general far-left politics, obviously acts as dissuading to your average person. The mainstream right has used this to its advantage, with it heightening its support for Israel in the wake of the war in Gaza. However, this has had the added effect of alienating much of the right and has contributed in the growth of various alt-right movements. A particular point made by the alt-right movement in general is that mainstream politics is heavily controlled by Israel, something that the left has seized upon, but has not done so to the extent of the right. This leads on to my next point, which regards the points which the pro-Palestinian movement does not address. Reason 4. The mainstream pro-Palestinian movement does little to actually criticize the intentions of the Israeli state and ignores the vital connection that the fundamentals of Zionism have in common with Judaism. A lot of what I am about to say here reflects a substantial amount of my personal opinion. I want to make it very clear here that I do not advocate for anti-Semitism or hatred of Jews in any way, and that I am strongly opposed to hatred and intolerance in all forms, but I do believe that this is important to address. The mainstream pro-Palestinian movement has done little to address the actual motivating ideology behind the state of Israel and its actions, from its very creation to its repression and campaign of genocide against the Palestinians. The blame is often targeted towards, quote, Zionists, a vague term that, while somewhat correct, as those carrying out this genocide and campaign of destruction against the Palestinians are Zionists. The fact that Zionism is itself a direct result of Jewish doctrine is never acknowledged, and in fact I myself am doubtful that a large amount of the pro-Palestinian movement knows very much of this fact. Whilst it is true that not all Zionists are Jewish, as there are plentiful examples of this, the movement itself is obviously rooted within the Jewish faith and eschatology. The reasons to dislike Zionism that are obvious to the world are frequently covered in the media and by political commentators, but hardly ever those reasons which link Zionism. Since its establishment, the State of Israel has leached off of Western support to sustain and bankroll its genocidal wars and colonial ethno-nationalist foreign policy aims. Its never-ending campaign of terror against the Palestinian people and wars of attrition against neighboring countries which stand in its way are carried out as a result of Western support and sometimes direct military involvement. Although these wars may not directly involve Israel, when you take into consideration Israeli interests, the strategic advantage that these wars have given Israel, and the little to no positive impact that these wars have had on the Western powers who actually did all of the heavy lifting on the ground, it starts to look as if Israel's aims stretch far beyond their internal security. Jewish ethno-nationalism should be taken into consideration when thinking about and criticizing Zionism as an ideology, and it never is, which in my eyes demonstrates a fundamental flaw of the mainstream pro-Palestinian movement. The movement itself is almost afraid to call this out as matter of fact, out of fear of being labeled as anti-Semitic over anything. In my eyes, and in the eyes of 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip who have suffered through 2 years of never-ending siege, there are things regarding the conflict which are far more important than being called anti-Semitic. The aims of Israel encompass more than just Gaza and the West Bank. Greater Israel is a very real goal of the current Israeli state, and I really do believe that the pro-Palestinian movement needs to do more to address this. In fairness though, I doubt the movement will be mainstream if it actually did confront and talk about this issue, but I think it would be highly beneficial for the movement if they did address this issue in further detail. I don't believe that my explanation here is good enough for someone trying to understand the goals of the Israeli state, and I could never do it justice in a constricted time span, but I do believe it is important to address here, albeit in minimal and somewhat lacking detail. My overall summary would be that the pro-Palestinian movement fails to address the very real and very dangerous goals of the Israeli state, often for reasons regarding so-called anti-Semitism. If the left are unafraid to call out the Trump administration and to label them as fascists, then they can do the same for the Zionist ultranationalist Jews who engage in dispossession and the genocide of the Palestinians, supported by Western backing and taxpayer funding.